one of the reasons I wanted to call in was yesterday, your guys' interview on NATO expansion kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Basically, I think a lot of people don't view Eastern Europe and Russia as having their own agency, and typically like to ignore all of the imperialism Russia engaged in almost immediately after it reconstituted itself after the fall of the Soviet Union. Because a lot of people forget this. The Russians invaded Moldova and caused the breakaway region of Transnistria. They put Central Asia under their thumb way worse than the U.S. has done in Latin America in the last 30 years. All of the, stuff they did scared the hell out of the former Warsaw Pact, and they all went running to NATO for protection. And then people say that this doesn't provide NATO with any benefit, but to that I would say the front line just got moved 500 miles away from their countries. And it makes the prospect of war go down because instead of dealing with an alliance of 600 million, now you're dealing with an alliance of 900 million, making the prospect of a conventional conflict with the Russians next to suicidal for the Russians to engage in. So, as far as a benefit goes, everyone in the alliance, especially the Eastern flank, benefits. And as Russia has expressed from the presidency to the Duma to the MOD, Poland is on the chopping block, Hungary is on the chopping block, and so is Romania. So, I mean, I don't really understand how people can say that those aren't legitimate concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I had some differences with Bessner on this, and I think your argument. I mean, I think the argument that had Ukraine, let's say, become a member of NATO prior, a year or two ago, let's say, just hypothetically, would that have made a Russian invasion, i.e. a war, more or less likely? I don't know if we can really answer that question because it's quite clear that Putin's estimation of the Russian army's capacity was wrong. So, you know what I mean? I mean, dramatically wrong. And had Ukraine been a member of NATO, then the war would have been a massive war. He might have been stupid to, attack a NATO country at that time, but there's no reason to believe that his intelligence about his own army's capacity was accurate to begin with. And so I don't know. But I mean, I think the point you're making is, a legit one. I think that the perspective, I think without speaking for Bessner, I think his perspective is that stopping the imperial designs of the United States, Trump inhibiting the imperial designs of Russia. I mean, I think that's, how that...
I would disagree greatly with that on its face. Now, don't get me wrong. The American empire is terrible and needs to be stopped. But if the retreat of a distant, democratic, although authoritarian when it comes to corporate interest empire, leaves a power vacuum for a militaristic, expansionist state that invades Ukraine with the express intent of genocide, I would say that is a bad shakeout, no matter how you look at it. They marched into Ukraine with the express intent to exterminate the Ukrainian identity. That's a different level of conflict than I think most people alive today are willing to really look at. I mean, the only parallel we have are a lot of the brush wars in Africa in the 90s, and most people aren't even aware that nearly 5 million people died in those.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm characterizing, I think, Bessner's argument. I think, I don't know, and I want to speak for him, but I think, there may be an argument that the rest of Europe would have, in the absence of a NATO alliance, I guess, built up their militaries in a way in which maybe they could carry this fight. There's not been a great history of European nations becoming military juggernauts. That hasn't worked out so well, at least in recent history. So I'm not sure that you necessarily want that. I feel like Derek was a little bit more, circumspect about those things. That was my sense. But look, I think there is value in examining these questions. I think it's important to sort of like hear that perspective, which I think, to the extent that we hear these perspectives, I think that, Bessner's perspective on it, I think is sincere and, laid out in good faith. I don't see how we could have not responded. And I do think that there is value in us, sort of like trying to steer the conflict. I've said this in the past, to have an end game, to have a line drawn as to like how, what kind of aid, military aid we give and for what ends. I think that's...
I actually would like to disagree with you a little bit on that one, if you'll let me explain.
Sure.
So, from how I understand geopolitics to work in the context of a war like this, by basically giving the Ukrainians a blank check, we are signaling to the Russians, politically speaking, Ukraine will not run out of money. They will not run out of ammo. They will not run out of fuel. You cannot win a war of attrition against them. It is fruitless for you to keep up this fight. They can outlast you in terms of resources. You should sue for peace immediately because you're just going to be throwing people into a wall of steel. That is the point of it, because that actually creates the conditions for peace. You cannot have peace with an invading genocidal army. If they were to just like do a white peace right now, people go back to their borders, the Russians will simply reconstitute themselves in 4 years and try again.
I think there'll be less
operandi since the 90s.
They'll be less likely to have peace. That's one of the other points I made is that like there's no way that end game can be articulated publicly. Because otherwise you lose the ability to bring, Russia to the table. But that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be going on. I think that you have to project we're in this for the long haul to the Russians for, if you're actually suing for peace. But I think there has to be on some level, and like I say, it very well already could be. There could be an end game articulated, within the Biden administration. There could be an understanding of like, we as an administration are willing to, we have basically hinted to Zelensky, you're going to regain this territory and not that territory, or that's as far as we go on this trip. That I would imagine, I would hope that there's something like that, but obviously you can't articulate it, because if you articulate it, then you're basically telling Putin just how, when you will quit. And so, yeah, I agree in terms of what needs to be argued what
But
needs to
that's
be
just
projected publicly.
one theory about how Putin could react to that. Because I mean, I talked to Yasha Levine, and he was a little bit more depressed about how Putin's settling in, and actually like the Manichaean rhetoric is backing up both sides. Now I buy that. I don't believe that we should be like saying peace because of what it's going to be Putin do. I think we need to be open to diplomacy, which is like all I've said, and gets people called tankies. But I think we need to be open to that, not because of like the message it sends Putin, but because we actually do need more than just us. Like the world, if the world lines up behind Russia, which I think everyone thinks is stupid to do, but like that's just the way politics is played out. Like historically, we need to be sensitive to more than just like sending a message that we think Putin's going to psychologically respond in the right way to. We need to build a world coalition. And that's why I think like everyone gets, there's a certain type of faction that I do have a real problem with. And I'm curious what you think about this, Kowalski. But whenever like there's something that like, oh, Blinken or whoever's going to meet with China and they might discuss this stuff, people get really sensitive about that stuff. And I think that is a big problem.
Well, like, I think us keeping up dialogue with everyone is good. From what I understand, we still even have dialogue between like our higher military ups and the Russians to make sure there's no miscommunication on nukes. Like that kind of conversation with China would be reached. That, and I do think that like no matter how this war shakes out, like obviously we all hope for Ukrainian victory, but when it's done, I do think that like Russia needs to have its sanctions lifted and the country needs to be rebuilt and reincorporated immediately, because we kind of have to work together as a planet to address the climate crisis. And for that, we need pretty much everyone on board with that. And I do also think that that is another big issue of letting a war like this flare up to where Russia is a regional power and to where countries tolerate this kind of military action. Because when you look at countries in Europe right now, Poland is going to be spending over 6% of its GDP on military spending for the next 10 years. That's what they've already allotted to do. They're not going to be working on seawalls, which they need. They're not going to be working on any climate mitigation projects, which they need. Instead, they're worried about national sovereignty from the real threat on their border. So, like, I don't really see how allowing any state to go rogue at this point and cause such mass disruption to be a good thing.
Yep. And
it's complicated. I know I don't have all the answers.
But I guess here's the one question, Kowalski. Like, what if like the disruption, quote unquote, becomes adjusted to and becomes actually a stable environment for both Russia and like Western like war powers?
I just don't think it would. There's too much history in Eastern Europe from the oppression that Russia has inflicted upon them for centuries. They will always just be paranoid. Like, legitimately, when like my grandfather got to Europe during World War II, he was the only member of our family left on the continent, and he had to come from the States. And it wasn't the Nazis that took them out. It was the Soviets prior to them being betrayed by the Germans. Like, the Russians have proven themselves to be a very bad actor from a military power standpoint, and nobody wants that to happen. Economically speaking, I think they could end up just like Germany as long as they stop being a military aggressor and just like basically submit to the European order of things. Like, I really think if Russia just acted like a normal country, no one would be upset about that. But they're acting like they're an imperial power that can express itself without consequence on an area that they view as their backyard. I don't believe that, like, no one here believes the U.S. has some sort of special domination of the Caribbean or Latin America. That's ridiculous. But yet we're supposed to be like, well, Russia doesn't feel comfortable when Ukraine is under NATO protection. Like, that doesn't make sense. And their national security is not in danger because they have nuclear weapons. Any invading army would not only get glassed, but so would their capital. So there isn't even a threat to Russia from a security standpoint.
I mean, I think I've always had a problem with the U.S. wouldn't tolerate, a Russian client state in Mexico, let's say.
I mean, Cuba.
But I would.
Right.
I would like us to, but we wouldn't.
Well, we didn't.
No, I don't think we would.
Yeah.
I don't think we would.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
but again,
we almost destroyed the world over it.
Right.
I'm not saying that isn't how the U.S. reacted. I'm saying that is what our principles are. We would not care if Cuba was in a military alliance defensive pact with the Chinese. I wouldn't care. It's not a threat. Any war between us ends in nuclear hellfire, so no one would do it.
Right. That's the same. I wouldn't care. I think U.S. policy would. But I appreciate the call, Kowalski.
Yeah, and Kowalski, just to bolster your point about denuclearization, that was also the point I tried to make a little bit to Bessner yesterday, just because I'm very much in favor of maintaining a soft power in the sense of incentivizing countries to do the right thing in terms of disarmaments when the United States says we'll have your back in that way. I think that's an extra wrinkle as well from the domestic perspective for the United States to hold on to the treaties that it's abided to as well. So that was another wrinkle, but we'll let you go.
Appreciate the call.
All righty. Wait, can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
I think we all know why Tim Pool is in the hospital, and it's because of what Emma did on air to him.
Yeah.
If you remember the IMs I've been sending, you know what that means. Goodbye.
Appreciate the call.
Many people are saying.